Great. Welcome, everybody. First of all, it's the first day of the Commission for Status of Women, so it's nice to be doing something early on in that. And welcome to this seminar, which specifically asks the question, how is backlash weakening institutional contexts for gender justice globally? To contextualize briefly by way of introduction, this seminar is hosted by the Countering Backlash programme, which is funded by the Swedish International Development Agency and hosted at the Institute of Development Studies, which, working in partnership with 9 countries, seeks to understand, respond to, and ultimately counter in solidarity the mounting backlash against gender justice across the world. Just to flag a couple of other events that we have coming up at CSW, we have an event on the 13th of March, which is hosted at the Lebanese American University. And there'll be a link to register if any of you are able to join in person or virtually for that event. And Ben will pop that into the chat. And another event hosted with the Ford Foundation on the following Tuesday, sorry, too many dates. So if anybody is able to attend those, please see the links that Ben will pop into the chat. So moving back to this event, we're joined today by partners and seed grantees on the project, who, as I said, will address the question, how is backlash weakening institutional contexts for gender justice globally, with a view from Lebanon, Bangladesh, Uganda, India, and Serbia. Our brilliant speakers today include, in this order, Nai, who is an intersectional feminist writer, researcher, and political activist from Lebanon; Pragna, a senior research associate at the BRAC Institute of Governance and Development in Bangladesh; Sandra, a dedicated advocate for digital rights and women's rights in Uganda, and the executive director of the Women of Uganda Network. We're hoping that Santosh will be able to join us, but he might be struggling with connection, who works as the executive director of Kolkatarista, which is a transgender community-based organization in India, and Nadja, a research associate at the University of Belgrade and the Faculty of Political Science. I'm Chloe. I am a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies in the Power and Popular Politics cluster, and we have Jirka, who's joining us as the discussant, who also is a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies. So the way the seminar will run is that I will pose a question to each of our speakers, who will then present answering that question. And Jirka will offer some reflections as the discussant, finding contradictions and convergences across the presentations. We'll then have approximately half an hour left for questions from the floor and to open this up into a plenary. So we look forward to wider participation in that last half hour. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to our speakers, starting with Nai. So Nai, focusing on Lebanon, can backlash against gender justice be institutional by default?
Well, okay, so I'm going to start just briefly saying that we can never really speak about adequately about backlash without addressing the structures that make up women's realities. The most visible today being militarism and colonialism, the devastating effects of which we've been seeing lately in Congo, Sudan, and Palestine, where as a result of Israeli occupation and the relentless months-long genociding in Gaza, 9,000 women were killed, 3,000 are now widows, 1 million are displaced, hundreds of thousands are undergoing childbirth without anesthesia, food, water, heat, or medical supplies. 700,000 are using tent scraps as menstrual pads, 90 are detained, starved, tortured, and sexually assaulted. And so this is like, I just wanted to start with this because this is an undeniable reality that needs to be talked about. Moving on to Lebanon, I'm going to engage with 4 pieces of literature that are particularly relevant to backlash. So I'm going to start with departing from the classical definition of Susan Faludi that talks about a backlash frames it as a part of a larger reaction to women's progress, that looks at it as part of the continuum, and that basically defines it as frames it as a response to actual or perceived challenges to existing hierarchies of power. The second is, fast forward to 2020, Rowley's call for a reconfiguration of our understanding of backlash, where it's no longer a reactionary pushback or anomaly, but a condition that is inherent within systems of oppression and the built-in self-protective mechanism. Third is Townsend Bell's spectrum which frames backlash again on a continuum that starts with the misogyny, racism node organized to maintain the status quo and ends with backlash as the overt acts of explicit and visible violence that respond to communities' claims to power. And she also speaks of a middle preemptive or remedial backlash node that prevents changes to the status quo and that does not require any action or any attempt to claim power. And the fourth is Maya Mikdashi's epidermal state. And while this is not necessarily part of the literature on backlash, it speaks of it's very particular to Lebanon to basically answer this question exactly, like, can it be institutional, can it be structural, in that the state in Lebanon performs its sovereignty by materializing and regulating bodies through secretization, through violence, through bureaucracy, through the law, using the body's gendered, class, racial, and sexual stakes as sites for this performance. And she speaks of this sovereignty as something that has always been obvious and violent towards vulnerable groups like queers and migrant workers, women, working women, refugees, the incarcerated, and sex work. So basically, this is part of the response to the question. But where we, as a context, as Lebanese context, diverge or divert from the backlash literature is in two parts. So first, obviously, the literature saying that it's mostly saying that it's reactive, when in fact we are closer to Rowley's definition, where it's beyond the reaction to a gain, where it's structured and embedded in the very system that make up our families, our communities, the state, and is permeating all the spheres, governmental, non-governmental, and the market. And second, the second diversion is the fact that where Townsend talks about remedial backlash, where we would nuance it and further say that there's a pronounced intentionality about preventing gains that is embedded in the system's design and that is meant to keep power concentrated in a minority that is positioned at a specific intersection of sex, gender, legal status, and class. So basically, the defining features of backlash in Lebanon is one, this pronounced intentionality that I just spoke about. Two, which makes it even more structural, the frail baseline position of women and other vulnerable communities within the system, where basic rights are systematically denied to them within the system's design. So claiming power is a far-fetched endeavor in that regard. And third, and that also adds another layer to the structurality of it, the site from which this quotidian or daily violence originates, which is basically from family systems. So women's exclusion results from power structures embedded in and flowing from family systems and into the state. So this is why the fourth feature is the function of this backlash, where it's a tool of misplaced action and an exit strategy for the system itself in a moment of overlapping crises. So our contextual definition basically flips the script on backlash, framing it as what dominant powers would do when their system goes through a moment of peril versus what the violence that marginalized communities endure when they make progress. It shifts the attention to the network of powers that perpetrate this violence. And it also frames the political juncture, not the power gains that the vulnerable communities have made as a system in crisis as the trigger of the backlash unleashed by its dominant players. So it also frames it as a tool to divert attention from looming socioeconomic menaces to help the system avoid existential discussions and to extend its longevity by creating imaginary enemies. So here's the definition. It's the various forms of structural discrimination and exclusion that are fed, incubated, and fueled by the sectarian epidermal system, and that fight and obstruct advocacy for rights. But more importantly, and I think this is the crux of the matter, it impedes the possibility of progress and gains. So this structural hostility departs from familial structures, travels across generations, and cuts through governmental, non-governmental institutions and the market. So the various forms of violence and backlash in Lebanon are not on a spectrum per se, but they're rather a pool of variegated tools that coexist and operate concurrently and complementarily, making up a patchwork of hostile strategies that authorities use on demand, depending on the requirements and the optics of the political moment. And apart from the systemic or the institutional violence as a default mode in Lebanon, there are other forms of backlash, the tactical and the atomized. I will only speak about the tactical if I have a few more minutes left.
Yes, you do.
Great. Okay, so the tactical backlash is basically I'm going to start this with a very short story. In June of 2022, a video showing a Beirut Pride, LGBTIQ Pride, basically, floral installation being vandalized went viral on social media. In this group, in this video, a group of men under the name of Jnoud al-Rab, or soldiers of God in Arabic, who proclaim to defend the Christian community against satanic endeavors, such as they mean the LGBTIQ communities and civil marriage, for instance, are seen ripping off the installation. So they were officially formed in 2019, and they claim to be, quote, ready to act if any phenomenon opposes their Christian convictions. So following this video release, the Lebanon's Ministry of Interior took measures to prevent any gathering of the community, calling these activities, again, quote, contrary to divine principles. And in the summer of 2023, the country's political and religious elite basically intensified their campaign against the queer community. For example, like the head of a very prominent political party called for the killing of LGBTIQ people. It went to that extreme, basically. And so in parallel to that, Jnoud al-Rab attacked a queer-friendly Beirut bar in Beirut, which was clearly marked an alarming escalation in anti-queer sentiment. So, but for context, Lebanon has yet to repeal Article 534 of the country's penal code, which basically criminalizes unnatural sex. It's vague, but it's mostly used to persecute the LGBTIQ community. It's a legacy of the French colonial era, but it's the most publicly debated regulation on sexuality. It reflects society's moral value system in that it remains largely traditional and relies on traditional gender roles and relations. But following the attacks in 2023, 2 parliamentary blocs proposed bills explicitly penalizing homosexuality. But the last decade in Lebanon has seen increased activism for sexual freedoms, queer-friendly bars opening, celebrities openly embracing their sexuality. And in parallel to that, there's also been an ongoing deployment of sexuality policing to manufacture moral panics over the heteropatriarchal nuclear family. And that has been a constant feature of governance in the country. So anti-LGBTIQ communities and campaigns ebb and flow based on the requirements of a junctural political moment. It's always instigated by political and religious authorities and always happens at the eve of elections. Similarly, civil marriage debates re-emerge periodically and tensions surge on the eve again of elections. And this fear-mongering appears to be stoked by political and religious authorities seeking to attack secular candidates mostly, who support civil marriage and who aim to maintain this attack aims to maintain the political status quo. So finally, to wrap up, both issues where we've seen debates and backlash basically are systematically and deliberately re-emerging time and time again over the past 2 decades at least, and are made to seem like pressing menaces to the entire social fabric. And they're exploited to construct these moral panics over perceived threats to the conservative family order, while the actual real threats to society, for instance, we've been in an ongoing downward spiral in terms of financial and economic meltdown in the country since 2019. So these menaces, these real threats, remain consistently dismissed. Practically no tangible progress has been made on these 2 fronts that require any kind of backlash or reaction, but rather ongoing and increasing resistance and hostility. So the debates around these 2 are only galvanized on demand to fend off any attempts at building an alternative, secular, and socially equitable system of governance for the country. So it's always been, not only has it always been institutional and structural, it's also it fabricates on demand panics around issues that have always been there, that have always been resisted, just because of a particular requirement of the political moment to extend the longevity of a system that is impaired, that is resisted. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nai. It's such an important highlighting of the structurality of backlash and the importance of contextual understandings of it. And I really like your framing there of backlash as impeding the possibility of change. So relatedly, moving to Bangladesh, Pragna, how can inaction, deprioritization, and a lack of accountability serve to inhibit gender justice institutionally?
Thank you, Chloe. It's a pleasure to be a part of this panel today. So I'll be speaking in reference to our Countering Backlash research, which looked at the implementation of the Domestic Violence Prevention and Protection Act of Bangladesh. As the name suggests, this act solely addresses the issue of domestic violence, and it was adopted by the Bangladeshi government in 2010. And it was seen as quite an achievement, for the government and the coalition that championed it. The coalition is called the Citizens Initiative Against Domestic Violence. So it was quite a good partnership between the women's movement and the government that made the act, that enabled the act to be adopted. However, now it's 2024. It's been 14 long years since the adoption. The act exists, but it is not being used. Its implementation is weak, and domestic violence rates are still very much prevalent in the country. So what went wrong? And to understand that, it was important for us to analyze it and analyze and look into the socio-cultural norms that exist in our country. And in Bangladesh, the prevalence of gender discriminatory and restrictive social norms has always led to stereotyping domestic violence as a matter of, as a personal matter. It's very trivial. It's a trivial issue. And that has often resulted in women not openly acknowledging their experience of violence. And they often refrain from seeking any kind of help or any kind of formal mechanisms of justice just because of the stigma associated with it. Here, marriage is also considered to be sacrosanct, and women are expected to put up with the never-ending violence if they face any, just to preserve their families. It's a way of maintaining their family honor, and the responsibility of maintaining the family honor only falls on the women. And all these gender discriminatory norms influence the behaviors and attitudes of the implementing agencies, the agencies that are responsible for implementing the Domestic Violence Act. They are actually very much dominated by these norms, which basically results in somehow delegitimizing and deprioritizing the issue of domestic violence, as we see from the weak implementation. Not only norms, it's a lot on the socio-political context as well. It plays a major role here if we are to understand how the state and state institutions have been addressing issues like domestic violence. During the Act's adoption, Bangladesh had a multi-party democracy, and gender equality was very much high on the government's agendas, and there were allies of the women's movement present in key government decisions. However, at present, the political climate has very much changed. Our political settlement has currently become a dominant party rule, and the state apparently is no longer responsive to seeking please the civil society. Because parliamentary elections have become non-functional, there's no alternative electoral champions, the state does not feel it's important to garner votes from certain parts of the population, like the women's movement or the leftists. And this has basically shrunk spaces for gender justice activists to negotiate and activate for gender equity agendas. So overall, under all these contexts, we wanted to explore that to what extent was this lax implementation? Was it due to the weak capacity of implementing agencies, or was it a deliberate form of inaction or intentional inaction in the form of backlash? And we conducted a series of interviews with the opponents and the proponents of the law, starting from women's rights activists to state institutions and actors in the state institutions like police, the judiciary, lawyers, etc. And we found that the weaknesses in the implementation are actually related to a subtle form of backlash against women's equality among service providers. And this form of backlash takes the form of deliberate inaction in implementing the provisions of the law. Social norms, ideologies about the family, prevalent among men and women, state institutions like judiciary, service agencies like the police and health services, all these result in neglect of the protection and egress from women and girls subject to DV. And very briefly, if I just give some examples, for instance, if we are talking about the legal practitioners, the lawyers per se, who are very much involved in the implementation process of the law, even they have the tendency to protect the sanctity of marriage and the need to maintain family honor. They hold stereotypical views which leads to victim blaming, declaring that women are at fault, or in some cases, women are adulterous, so they're having extramarital affairs, which is leading to domestic violence, or even women file false cases against their husbands just to receive money, because often litigations lead to divorce. There's also a tendency where domestic violence is trivialized, and the dominant attitude is that it is a personal issue and it is not an important enough issue that should bother the judiciary, which is dealing with more substantial matters and serious crimes. The same goes for the state institutions like Ministry of Women and Children Affairs, which is called MOCA, or the Department of Women Affairs here, where we saw that there was a disavowal or lack of institutional ownership by these institutions. And these actors, they were not really clear about their roles in the implementation process. And often they were seen mediating or trying to solve the issues between the couples rather than taking legal measures. And their perception was to not disrupt the social harmony and not use any legal way or legal measure just to maintain the relationships or the marital relationships and maintain social harmony. And when they were asked about their negligence, they would rather say that, it's a capacity issue. It's their lack of capacity and resources that did not allow them to basically take any further steps in implementing the act. And same goes for the police. There was this lack of priority towards the issue. So overall, it is seen that, domestic violence, it is a violation of human rights, right? But the dominance of social norms and the political climate over the implementing bodies results in refusal to acknowledge it as a form of, human rights violation. So it is concerning to see how this human rights violation is continuing to be viewed as a personal matter. It's less important than real crimes, and how it continues to be seen as a matter that is to be resolved internally, informally, within the couple, without government intervention for redress. And this is deliberate inaction, which is the result of a backlash against the principles and values of the act, the values of the women's movement in Bangladesh. So this translates into inaction institutionally, where the state and other actors would rather send women back to their homes, back to their abusive marriages, instead of disrupting the status quo and giving the responsibility of safeguarding the marriages to women. So yes, it's a little frustrating when I talk about domestic violence, because every time over the last 5 or 6 years, whenever I've spoken on this issue, somehow the challenges remain the same. Nothing has changed over the last 5 or 6 years of my career experience, at least. So with everlasting sticky social norms and a non-responsive state with shrinking spaces for gender justice negotiations, effective implementation of the Act or Domestic Violence Act will basically need a fundamental change in norms and attitudes among implementers. And that's quite a challenge, I must say. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Pragna, for highlighting the devastating and near universal trivialization of gender violence and highlighting intentional inaction and lack of implementation as backlash. So turning to legislation in Uganda, Sandra, could you tell us how legislation is being weaponized in Uganda to weaken institutional contexts for gender equality?
Thanks, Chloe, for the question. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're joining us from. As Chloe clearly put it together, looking at the context of Uganda, there's been a lot of several laws and policies enacted in the few last decades to promote gender equality. But you tend to see that there's been a lot of mismatch, especially between the Uganda's pro-gender equality legal frameworks and its implementation that has led to the persistence of gender-based inequalities. And looking at the civil society operation, especially women-led civil society organizations, they have been affected especially by the shrinking civic space, branded especially by the restrictive legislation such as the Non-Governmental Act 2016 and the Public Order Management Act. And more recently, there was also the past Computer Misuse Act and the Anti-Homosexuality Act that is commonly referred to as AHA. So several civil society organizations have been faced with the suspensions, the freezing of accounts, the denial of funding, among other restrictions on freedom of expression, association, and assembly. And speaking specifically, looking at the NGO Bureau, there's been a number of increasing bureaucratic requirements and more stricter timelines, especially for women-led civil society organizations, but broadly for non-governmental organizations. And this has been a system in terms of targeting NGOs that are engaged in advocacy or are monitoring government activities that have been subjected to a lot of pressure. And looking back to 2020, there was about 2 foreign citizens that were engaged in government-related and non-profit work, and they were accused for supporting the regime change. And there was also a denial of entry to foreign citizens that were working with international non-governmental organizations such as the Democratic Governance Facility, known as the DGF, and other institutions such as the non-democratic institutes. And these were organizations that were funding very many grassroots women's rights organizations advocating for the rights of marginalized and women's rights organizations. Interestingly, I have visited a remote organization based in northern Uganda last week, and they were still trying to recover from the loss of DGF because they were funded and they're doing a number of work on governance and accountability in the country. So you can see the impacts of weaponizing legislation. And also 2 NGOs were also planning to observe the 2021 elections, had their accounts temporarily frozen on the order of the Financial Intelligence Authority. And although the decisions were reversed by the High Court, but you see that organizations such as the Uganda Women's Network really suffered the impact, being a women's movement that brings together different organizations that are advocating for gender equality in Uganda, operating for not 1 year can affect loss of staff and also the work itself on promoting gender equality. And looking at some of the civil society organizations that were also closed, about 55 organizations closed by the NGO Bureau, and their operations were affected. And these were organizations that are very vocal, engaging in work on advocacy, human rights, issues of oil, and all that. But you tend to see that the suspensions really contradict what the NGO Act 2016 says, which says that they aim to promote a very conducive and enabling environment, allowing freedom of expression for non-governmental organizations and strengthening or promoting the capacity to collaborate with the government. But we tend to see that that is the contrary. So you tend to see that majority of the women-led civil society organizations, especially those who are working with structurally silenced groups, such as the sex workers, the lesbians, the LGBTI community in general, really are facing challenges in advocating for their work. And they're generally considered as groups that are working with people engaged in criminal or immoral activities in general. So there's been a number of attacks, violent reactions to the progress of gender equality and women in general, raiding of shelters of the LGBTI community, the killings, and a number of it. But also there's been a number of the frequent violent policing of women and feminists who belong in the public space, such as women in the leadership position, the journalists, the politicians, the women's human rights defenders. But also speaking directly to the Anti-Homosexuality Act 2023 that was passed in May last year, the law really criminalizes the vaguely worded work of promoting homosexuality. And most organizations or individuals go along with saying that it's promotion of homosexuality, not seeing that it's affecting everyone. If you house an individual who identify in a way that's not accepted by the community, then it's a challenge. So there's been a number of effects or challenges with representative of human rights organizations and even donors who are supporting work done by this organization. And now, based on the law, you face around 20 years of imprisonment. So there's been a number of violations of rights guaranteed in the Uganda's constitution, and also looking at the law leading to increased self-censorship, especially within the online community, and individuals, organizations altering their online presence because of fear of being harassed, fear of being prosecuted because of the law. And last year there was a national prayer breakfast being held, including religious, radical individuals, and this caused a lot of hate speech. But also this has led to a number of increased gender disinformation, targeting direct organizations and activists who are working on issues around sexual and reproductive health. But also we've seen a rise in anti-gender, anti-LGBTIQ discrimination. And with discrimination, it really leads to cases like perpetuating a cycle of inequality, injustice, and this leaves individuals marginalized and vulnerable. For instance, there were about 159 incidences of discrimination documented by an organization or a team of people called the Strategic Response Team. And this worry really the state of human rights and the progress of gender equality in general. So to make it worse, most of these cases have not been reported to the police because of fear of arrest under the Act. And this shows that the law is therefore promoting an environment of loneliness to the loss of real or suspected persons in Uganda without any recourse, but also the persistence and the organized efforts throughout 2022 to 2023 of silencing organizations working with or on behalf or led by LGBTI community is worrying. So a number of organizations were closed, but one of it that is commonly known is the Sexual Minority Group, whereby their operation were stopped because they were alleged to be promoting homosexuality. So the government really trying to use homosexuality to crack down on freedom of expression and freedom of assembly is really worrying, because if NGOs are closed, then we will not be able to support human rights work. But also it became worse when the AHA bill was tabled in Parliament because they were promoting homosexuality was codified, and many organizations listed were harassed, attacked. And looking back, organizations such as ISIS Wiki, which is commonly known as ISIS Women's International Cross-Cultural Exchange, whereby they broke into their office and the computer hardware was missing. So that means that they're interested in knowing the work or getting the data of organization. And some other organizations such as the Women Human Rights Defenders Network and the Community Transformation Foundation Network that are doing work around ensuring the community gets compensated for the work that they're doing around in Masaka. So this really affects the overall progress that is being made on gender equality, seeing institutions such as the World Bank pausing all the lending to Uganda until the amendment of AHA, and the EU, of course, did not stop their support to Uganda, but because they thought it would affect the vulnerable and structurally silenced group. But then the hack really harms the lives of not only the community, but also other Ugandan citizens outside the community. But besides the law, it's very important to also pay attention that there has been an increased gender disinformation as an act of or a tactic for gender backlash. And this has led to a lot of silencing of different civil society progress on gender equality. And we really appreciate partnership with IDS, Institute of Development Studies, enabling organizations such as WUGNET to form panel of experts that are looking at how to counter the online backlash, building alliances with gender justice actors, but also identifying efforts that can be done to promote gender equality and pro-gender policies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandra, for really interestingly as well highlighting the contradictions across different legislations and the deliberate instrumentalization of that to police, control and repress. Finally, before I move to the last presenter, I just wanted to say if you do have questions for the panel, please do put them in the Q&A section of the webinar, and we'll have time in the last half hour to address some of these. So last but not least, moving to Nadia. Nadia, how are alliances between religious actors and conservative politicians weakening institutional contexts for gender justice in Serbia and in neighbouring countries?
Thank you for the question, and I'm really glad to be here with all of you today and hear about different contexts, but at the same time we can find some similarities and some similar tactics. So in my very short presentation today, I would like to give you a little bit of insight about some defining historical moments from Serbia and this region that has brought us to what is happening today. And on the other hand, I would like to just like in bullets, show you some tactics that the right-wing actors are using in the last couple of years. So just to start with the context, I would really like in this international context to mention that this year in post-Yugoslav countries, we are celebrating and mentioning and analyzing yet again the fact that 50 years before today, so in 1974, in the Constitution of Socialist Federative Republic of Yugoslavia, there was Article 191, which stated that the right of choice, the freedom of choice for everyone. Of course, even before the Constitution, abortion was legal in the Federative Socialist Federative Republic of Yugoslavia, but that they in 1974 in that Constitution it was included in the Constitution. So I'm mentioning that not just because of the anniversary, but also because of the fact that in socialist period we have state that wanted that put women's emancipation at the front, and we have some problems with the unequal development in different parts of the state, also with glass ceiling, but the support for women equality and women were fighting during the Second World War was like at the top of the agenda. Then in the 90s, the wars came, and sharply women were like erased from public sphere. They were nowhere to seen in a public sphere, just some very important, very influential right-wing women, but all the others were in a way erased. But on the other hand, we also had brutal wartime violence with the rape crimes in Bosnia, in Croatia, and Kosovo. And also that is something that shifted the previous context, and that's where the counter-gender backlash started in our region. Then after the wars, we have newer generations of feminists. Also now the people from LGBTIQ plus communities started enter the public sphere. So on the one hand, we have all those progressive actors, but on the other hand, we have right-wingers that are now and now I'm talking in Serbia, but also in some neighboring countries that are capitalizing on their success during the 90s. They are using about their tactics. They are using so-called democratic tools, but against democracy. What I'm meaning with that is that they abuse the rights of freedom of expression to debate about constitutional and rights on reproductive rights, for example. Also, they're using it to say we can debate about anything, for example, but they don't have a legal rights debate, for example, of some questions about gender sensitive language, but they are misusing and misusing the rights on freedom of expression, for example. Also, they are so connected with the now neoliberal capitalist state that has its elite who are on one way, they are pinkwashing. For example, we have a prime minister, she's a lesbian, but on the other hand, they are also very connected with Orthodox Church and with religious actors who are at the same time attacking abortion rights, reproductive rights, gender-sensitive languages. So we have that neoliberal capitalistic state that is at the same time like a false friend and enemy. And what is the problem is that right-wing actors, intellectuals, people from church and from other religions also, they have structural help to misuse our rights, and also they have they're very popular amongst people in different kinds of researches. Again and again, we hear that they are someone who should be trusted. So when they are trusted, they are using false information about the LGBTI communities, a lot of prejudice. Also, they're using emotionally charged talks and speeches they want to they're very concerned about the so-called well-being of children because they are afraid how they're calling it gender ideology would destroy traditional family and similar tactics they're using. They're like trying to push people to believe that the feminist and LGBTIQ and gender equalities is against what was like traditional, what was good. Of course, that's not true. In a way, it is, because we don't want a traditional family that is very highly misogynistic, that is the place of gender-based violence, as we see again and again and again. Also, we have a lot of femicides in Serbia and in region happening inside those so-called traditional families. But that is not the discourse that is coming to the mainstream media, because mainstream media, clerics, in Serbia, Orthodox have most power. Then right-wing actors from academia, they're all joining together to attack so-called gender ideology. And of course, the last tactic that I would like to mention is international connections. Last May, we had first international congress organized in this region. It was some kind of quasi conference. It's not a real conference. It just imitates the real conferences. But there were actors from all around the region, from all around the world, and all of them were attacking different kinds of gender equality laws, reproductive rights, etc., etc. So they are very starting to getting more and more international support. And we also, of course, from this region, from Serbia, we can trace a lot of influence from Russia from one side. And you know that in Russia, they have anti-gay laws. So we will hear from time and time again from some kind of right-wing intellectuals that maybe we should do as Russians do. They are like, not Russians, but Putin state, they want to save their Orthodox family. Maybe we should do the same. Of course, that's not in that level now. I can say that it's that bad, but it's really, we can feel that kind of influence from one side, but from the other side, we can also feel the influence, for example, from Trump's administration and what they have been doing. So we have like Orthodox clerics that were saying, great, have you seen that in the United States of America now, the justice system now don't support abortion rights. So sometimes they are also right. So, they are getting international camaraderie from all around the world. It's just for them, the right-wing coalitions are important. And just to finish, I think that in our region, and especially from Serbia, we can say that the backlash is now a process that is long for 3 decades, but it is not one-sided. So we have the right-wing alliances that are keeping themselves like very active, and they're attacking rights. But on the other hand, we also see the progressive alliances that are getting more and more strong with younger generations. Also, they are joining the fight as a feminist, as LGBTIQs. So I think that from this region, what we can maybe add to this discussion is that when we are talking about the gender backlash, we're always talking about two sides of coins, and we shouldn't just like analyze what the right wingers are doing. We should maybe in a way compare it with what has been done in this progressive part of the society. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nadja. It's alarming to hear the alliances against gender ideology, but so-called gender ideology, but also amazing to hear that alliances against that are strengthening in that context. And that points to the urgent need for intersectional and anti-colonial solidarities and alliances globally to counter the backlash. So thank you so much to all of the speakers. Those were incredibly amazing and rich presentations, highlighting the urgency again of contextualizing backlash and then building these sorts of conversations to see how we can find these resonances, these points of contradiction, and therefore entry points to resist together. So last but not least, we're going to turn to Jirka, who has the no small job to find the threads across these presentations and lead us into the plenary. So Jirka, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Chloe. Thank you, Nadja, Sandra, Pragna. Sorry for my pronunciation here. And as Chloe said, what an amazing, rich set of presentations you've given. And I have the challenging task of not necessarily summarizing it, but to reflect on it a little bit. So I had there are three things that I've been thinking about listening to you around recurrent types of actors, despite the contextual differences in your different settings. There seems to be, across your countries as well as other countries we've read about in, for example, IDS Bulletin, there are these recurring actors, the populist sort of right-wing politicians, the theocratic power brokers or the religious power brokers. They come up in every presentations in different ways, very different ways in some cases. And there are often ethno-nationalist, kind of militarist interests has been alluded to, and particularly in Serbia in relation to links with Russia and so on. But we haven't heard from India. We were hoping to hear from Santosh, and of course that those ethno-nationalist actors are very important and hard right. I sometimes think of them as fascist actors. Very important in India and also in other countries like Turkey, Russia, and so on. But there is also the big money backers. There is some allusions to oil interests in Uganda, for example. Donors came up, but they have a very complicated relationships to this, I guess. And in Serbia, we heard a little bit about, the role of elites, the neoliberal elites aligning with the theocratic interests. So there's something about, teasing out what types of actors are active here. And that kind of links to this contradiction alluded to again, that they're often very internationally connected, despite they're often arguing that this is, traditional local Ugandan or Bangladeshi values against the foreign values. So that's an interesting aspect. Of course, you all talk about institutions, and my second theme or thing I'm trying to pick up on. And what I'm hearing is, of course, that there is a lot of this politics takes place in institutions. We hear a lot about closing of civic space, and stalling and non-implementation of rights and so on and laws. But my question here is, we're seeing institutions being repurposed to serve particular interests, and therefore, what are we meaning by weakening institutional contexts? Weakening for whom? And what can we learn about that? And then there is this topic taking us back to Nai's presentation about the embeddedness, the structural embeddedness and permanence of backlash versus its episodic nature, and whether or not, or whether it's indeed both, that it is systemically embedded and then it flares up at particular periods of crises, for example. And we hear from Uganda and Bangladesh fairly similar reaction, I suppose, and I see this as a kind of post-colonial nation states undergoing similar kind of national projects of increasingly autocratic reshaping of institutions, pitting the nation against the West. And then, of course, in Serbia and Lebanon, the contexts are different, seem to provide good examples of how power dynamics between faith brokers and the state, in particular, strengthening the hand of faith-shaped ideologies being used in politics. And that sets within the region, sub-regional histories of conflict. And indeed, the word Balkanization, of course, comes from the Balkans and that part of the world. And that is a major problem in global politics at the moment. So we haven't, as I said, we haven't heard much from India, where we see more of the kind of imperial nation building, the ethno-nationalist idea that we're one people, like Putin sees Russia, like Erdogan sees Turkey, and so on. And then, yeah, I could go on, and I don't want to go on too much. I mentioned one contradiction between, it's us against the world, local values against the world, whilst all these actors are internationally connected, including the faith-based organizations and the capital, or the capital interests, but also the donors have a very complex role in this. We've read about how European and American funding has gone to faith-based groups in Uganda and countries like Kenya, which has essentially facilitated the anti-homosexuality backlash to some degree. Two other contradictions here is that these actors appear as unified against gender ideology, as Nadia mentioned, but this is all a distraction from the fact that the different actors involved in the backlash, their interests don't actually align. So the hyper-rich neoliberal elite and the theocrats, they have very different interests from the brawlers in the street going out to demonstrate against gender, for example. And then the final contradiction, of course, is that they are demonizing gender activists and anything to do with gender as political. But of course, they are weaponizing gender and using it as a political football. So they are the ones being political. I'll stop there. So you can have that minute back, Chloe. Thanks.
Thanks, Jirka. That was great to have some bringing together all of the different talks like that as we move into the plenary. So there are some questions in the Q&A chat, which I will try and address to each of the speakers as they come up. If more arrives as we're talking, then please do pop them in the chat. And as I said, I will do my best to address them. I'm going to pose two that have been asked to Pragna, so I'll come to you first, Pragna. The first one is, are there refuges for women and children in Bangladesh, and is it seen as dishonourable to access them? The second question is that you mentioned there are organisations responsible for implementing the new law, and that these tend to overlook common social behaviours such as violence against women. What tactics have you found to be successful in holding these organisations accountable?
Great. So I'll just respond to the first question. Yes, there are different refuges where women victims of survivors of violence can go to. We have victim support centers, both run nationally and some by different NGOs. But yes, that's also something that is seen dishonorable, not in the sense that, the ones at the victim support centers, they are very much biased or they have stereotypical views on survivors. But the fact that a woman is stepping out of the marriage or stepping out of the house to go and report violence incidences, even for the sake of taking refuge, that itself, in Bangladesh's perspective, is considered to be dishonorable or something that disrupts the status quo. But there are provisions for victim support centers and other places where women can go to sometimes with their children as well. But it's not much used because at the end of the day, it's all about how much they are comfortable in terms of reporting their violence and stepping out of their house. And oftentimes, even if they do step out, even if they do go and complain, or even if they do go and take refuge, their partners, particularly the husbands, they tend to take drastic actions like, filing a divorce or sending a divorce notice. So that doesn't work all the time for the women's favor. And for the second question, there are actually a number of strategies that have been used by coalition members, the coalition that has been advocating for domestic violence, CIDV. And it starts from, advocacy, different events, networking, informal networking, or even holding trainings, etc., capacity building. But it's a little difficult to understand what was successful till date, because as we can see, implementation still remains weak. But what has worked over the years has been the recent COVID pandemic, where a lot of attention basically shifted to the issue of domestic violence, because it was termed as the shadow pandemic. And a lot of international attention was being given to domestic violence. So a lot of awareness was being raised in the country, in Bangladesh in particular. And there were a number of studies and evidences that were carried out just to increase the awareness of the issue. So that was successful. That got highlighted. Even the coalition, who remained inactive for a while, they started reviving their activities once the pandemic started. But in terms of the other measures, for instance, the advocacies and the events, they work from case to case. For instance, if an NGO is doing it with certain panel lawyers per se, if they have certain panel lawyers, they are educating them, they are providing them the training, so they are more sensitized, as opposed to the other lawyers or the most of the lawyers outside. So it depends from case to cases. It's something that the coalition really needs to work on at the moment. That is, what are the new tactics, or what are the new strategies that might help in ensuring the effective implementation of the act. But yeah, it's still work in progress even after 14 years.
Thank you, Pragna. And the other thing to note actually is that some of these presentations are actually drawn from articles that are in the IDS bulletin that we've just released, the Countering Backlash bulletin. So just to flag, if we don't manage to get to each of your questions, they may be in the bulletin entitled Understanding Backlash, Sovereign Perspectives. And Ben's just popped the link for that into the chat. So Sandra, there is a question for you. So you mentioned the Anti-Homosexuality Act, which is currently being challenged in courts. The question is any international action, including the removal of World Bank financing, having any impact on the discussion at this time?
Thank you so much for the question. What I would say is that there have been a number of initiatives being done. And what I can say right now, there's been a sort of understanding the issue at hand, with the consideration that there's already a law in place, and the law can be used against you to also pin you down. For example, organizations such as the Amnesty International has been in touch with us, sort of understanding the research, and they were starting to understand the state tactics being used to limit online civic space for women, girls, and LGBTI community at large. And for me, I feel that that is a step, because for you to influence anything, you need evidence, and evidence is research for you to create change. And of course, several discussions that have been going under the Global Digital Compact, and a number of issues are being enlightened, informing some of the upcoming discussions, such as the Summit of the Future that is happening, I think, in September in New York. And just in February, also we had a training for women-led civil society organizations with ICNL, International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, and sort of a consultation meeting that was for women human rights defenders or civil society on enabling issues for Uganda. So I would say that is progress enough, but more still need to be done in trying to see how to especially see ways to maybe scrap off the AHA bill or the act that is in place by the discussions. And we really appreciate organizations that has been at the forefront, especially nationally, such as Chapter 4, who has been in court trying to challenge the law and trying to see that there's change for a better environment for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. Turning to Nadja, there is a question for you about the challenges from various actors who are consolidating their voices against women's and LGBTQ rights. What is missing from those progressive organizations to come together and counter that backlash?
Thank you for the question. It is really important, I think. First of all, I think mainly what is missing is money, funding, not in a way like funding from year to year and like non-continuous funding, but really structural support. Like I think that really a lot of us are working a lot. NGO sector in Serbian region is often burned out in so many different ways. Also, we now had the 8th of March, and one of our colleagues is like getting attacked in the media. So right-wing medias and all those actors are attacking constantly. So they are really using all their resources to exhaust us. That's one thing. The other thing is we really need, like, in a way, we are against the elite. So we can't expect of them to give us all the structural support we will need. This is not socialism anymore of any kind. It's like the neoliberal elites are really against gender equality. That's what the system is. This system is reproducing inequalities in so many different ways. So it's really a different, what is missing? We are missing the system that is just. So, it maybe my answer is now like, okay, we are missing everything. In a way, we are. But on the other hand, I think that what really helps is that if we are getting attacked again and again, we are trying to make broader alliances. So, for example, we will call people, organizations that are dealing with ecological inequalities. We are very well connected with the peace initiatives. So what is helping is building broader and broader alliances. But it really is like hard work because we are against the state in a way, not. So thank you again for your answer, for your question.
Thanks, Nadja. I think you pointed to a really important aspect of backlash, which is how exhausting it is and how exhausting it is to keep coming up against that. So a question I'm going to direct to Nai, particularly drawing on your analysis of the structurality of backlash, the continuous nature of backlash. What do you see as the effective power of backlash? How do you see what does that produce in people's bodies, in people's minds, in people's strategies and modes of engagement and their capacity to do so?
First, let me start by saying that this has been so Maya Magdashi's work on the epidermality, like on the epidermal state, she has a very brilliant analysis and unpacking of this, in a sense that, so I don't know if you're familiar with the context in Lebanon. We had a massive uprising in 2019, and there was a brutal repression by security forces, like both state and non-state actors, basically. And this was nationwide. And so many analysts and so many political scientists were appalled and were surprised that the state in Lebanon is violent, as in the fact that this was the first time that they see this visible violence. It has never been visible to them. But in her analysis, Maya speaks of how this has always been, the state has always been sovereign and violent and obvious to everybody else but your standard man, basically, in Lebanon. So basically, she speaks about how the bodies of the incarcerated, sex workers, people who have substance abuse issues, women, queer communities, any visibly different kind of person within their reach has always been a victim and a target of this kind of violence, and it's always been embodied. And she speaks of the epidermal state because it's something that shows on the skin and something that's on that you can see. And she speaks of a lot of encounters in detention centers against migrant workers, against women who work in reputable human rights organizations who come to the rescue of, or who basically speak on behalf of migrants or refugees in incarceration, basically. And so I think this has always taken a toll on us, and our reality, we've never known really anything else. Like the fear of this kind of violence has always been present. So it's not like it's been something has changed really now, but in the past year, this has basically come back with a vengeance. It's brought with it a lot of flashbacks of what used to happen before 2019 and what was never talked about in terms of how we feel about this, in terms of the threats with the anal test, which is basically it's an archaic practice that in police stations, in detention centers, they use to make sure that the person has not had anal sex by inserting an egg into their anus. I'm sorry about the graphicality of it. And sometimes they would do it, and a lot of times they would basically threaten with it. They would threaten women or sex workers or anybody that they suspect were, different or sex or anything, basically, with virginity tests. Like, all of this is what's been happening in the past year. The fact that there's been an escalation against queer people in general has brought a lot of flashbacks of these things that were not spoken about. I don't know if I answered the question, actually, but this is something that I really want to reiterate the fact that this is not a reaction to anything. This is the status quo of the state in this country. This is how it deals with, it regulates bodies, it regulates the system. This is how it keeps everybody in check, by basically using the gendered aspect, the sexed aspect, the class aspect of their being and their existence.
Thank you. No, it's really important, and really important to remember in view of that longevity also, that people are traumatized, and that this is happening in a context of ongoing and unfolding trauma and violence. There are two further questions that move us towards how we counter this. So these were addressed to all of the speakers. So opening it up to the floor, there's one question, which is, what would be the speaker's recommendations on addressing the strategic targeting of women's rights by anti-gender movements? And what could be done differently by CSOs, academia, and UN agencies? So opening it up to the floor. Nadia.
Like a billion-dollar question, but I think that we should use as many possible means we have. So we should, like, every time when our rights are not defended and someone is misusing the law, we should like say, okay, also use some advocacy rights, also connect internationally. So whatever they are doing, let us do also, but for our means. You know, they're very good in strategizing. They would do, for example, we had just one book in primary schools that mentioned gender, something about gender. And they were so like aggressive and going all around the media just for one sentence. You know, I would say like it's one sentence, it's not important, but for them, everything is important. So I think maybe we should like copy some of the methods. Like, okay, if they would make a fuss about one sentence, then let us do it. If they would make a fuss, if someone is attacking their right to debate, then every time when they are attacking our rights, we should like, etc. So I think that one maybe possible answer would be to use all the different kind of making pressure against their pressure, and also use creativity. I'm from cultural sector also. I think that different kind of artivism, so-called, is very used to communicate the ideas in approachable way. That's some suggestions.
Thank you, Nadja. Yes, creativity and imagination, and also hope, right? We need a politics of hope, or especially right now in the state of the world, it feels unimaginable. So we need to maintain that hope as the condition for all struggles. Nai.
I thought you'd miss my voice, so I took the opportunity to speak now. I think it's crucial to understand the political economy of these groups, and that just like Backlash in our contexts does not exist in a vacuum. These people do not operate also like in silos or in vacuums or somewhere, you know, detached from other powers. So I would say, you know, realizing that these, first of all, let's put our finger on what is anti-gender and what these powers are doing and where they're getting their money from and whose acknowledgement they're getting. Because a lot of the times, the donors that fund our projects also be funding state-sponsored stuff that exert violence, or state-sponsored institutions, or the army. Or I know the army might not be necessarily the perpetrator of the actual backlash, but it's very crucial to understand that these people operate in tandem and they work together and they get the approval basically and the sign off of the state. And so basically when donors who work with us and who claim to be in states, foreign aid agencies, the UN, sometimes when they do fund certain projects that are, you know, performed by us, and then they also fund something that's sort of antithetical or sort of like, you know, done or performed by institutions that if not perpetrators of backlash, they're silent enablers of it. And so I think it's very crucial to put the finger on that and to say, like, to call people out, especially people with clout, especially institutions with money, institutions with resources and with connections, and who sometimes our movements need for sustenance. And I think we don't speak about this enough, and we should talk about this more. So that these are my 2 cents on it.
Thank you, Nai. And yeah, incredibly important to speak to the hypocrisies within the global system and how that plays out within institutions. I'm going to open up the floor for the last 10 minutes to see if the panelists have any questions for each other, having heard presentations and reflections from Jirka. So over to each of you if any of you have a question for each other.
I think we've spoken to each other so much over the past years. We've exhausted the questions.
Exhausted the questions, yes. For the audience, this is through much deliberation, this process. So unless anyone on the floor has any more burning questions, then we may leave 10 minutes early. which rarely happens. We'd, as I said, we did have a fifth speaker, Santosh, but they couldn't join us, sadly.
Are there not more questions in the chat line, or the questions from the audience?
No, there's none from the audience. So unless you have a burning one, Jirka, I'll conclude.
No.
Okay, great. So we've all gained 10 extra minutes from not being on Zoom, which I think we all have a lot in the bank from COVID to reclaim. So to conclude, thank you so much to all of our speakers for such excellent and rich and also devastating presentations. And so often we want to hear the quick answers to counter. We want to hear how we can change it. And I think sometimes hearing the devastation is necessary. And from that space, we can work together in solidarity to better grapple with and address all of the many systems of power and domination and violence across the globe right now, manifesting in gendered ways, in sexual ways, in racial ways, and of course, economic ways. So thank you so much to all of our speakers. Please do see our bulletin, which has been put in the chat. Please do see our upcoming events at CSW, and wishing you all the best for the next 2 weeks.